300 people watch him lie face down in the dirt at the altar. 7 times the stone flared blue. 7 times the light died, giving him nothing. And then his father turns his back and walks away without a single glance. He pushes himself up on shaking arms, and the worst part is the silence. Laughter would mean he still exists to someone. Silence means he is already erased. Here they have a word for what he is. Hollow. No system, no magic, no weapon heavier than a knife, no land, no guild, no army except as arrow fodder in the front line. That is the entire list of options for a hollow in the Kingdom of Hairan. He stands up. His legs shake, but they hold. He wipes the dirt off his mouth and looks at the dead blue symbols on the stone. But the altar scanned only the body. It could not scan what was inside. 28 years of another life in another world where altars did not exist, and people still sorted each other into worthy and worthless. He remembers fluorescent lights. He remembers the hum of a computer fan. He remembers dying alone at his desk on a Friday night in an office in Incheon and not being found until Monday. He remembers 4 people at his funeral. One of them was a delivery driver at the wrong building. These memories are not supposed to be here, but they are, and they are more real than the dirt on his face. He walks down the hill and looks at the village below. 200 houses, thatched roofs, a river to the east, forest to the north, mountains to the west. And he catches the thought and holds it. This is a starting position. He spent 20,000 hours in strategy games, and he knows a bad start when he sees one. Poor resources, no allies, no army. 1 wounded unit. Himself. Rough. Not impossible. And then the altar behind him makes a sound. Not a glow, a hum. Low and deep, like a machine warming up in a basement. He turns. The priest is gone. The guards are gone. Nobody is watching. But a line of light floats in the air at eye level, visible only to him. Daily companion summon. He reads the number. 86,400. The seconds in a day. A second line appears. First summon, ready. Accept. As if the altar had been saving this for him. As if the 7 failures were never failures at all, but a filter. A test with no right answer except the will to stand back up with dirt in your mouth. He reaches out. His finger passes through the light. So he says it out loud. Accept. And the air in front of him splits open. Not beautiful like a portal in a movie. Ugly. A jagged tear 2 meters tall with edges like burnt paper. Something falls out of it. A body. A girl. She hits the grass on her hands and knees, and the tear seals behind her. She is gasping. Her hair is matted with what might be blood. Her leather armor is scorched down the left side as if she walked through fire. In her right hand she grips a blackened, chipped sword. Her eyes are open, but she is not seeing the grass or the sky. She is still seeing whatever just broke her, badly enough for the altar to reach across worlds and pull her out. He does not strategize. He does not calculate. He pulls off his own cloak and steps forward and drapes it over her shoulders. She flinches so hard she nearly stabs him. The sword whips up and misses his throat by a handspan. He does not step back. He crouches down, level with her eyes, and waits. 10 seconds. Her breathing slows by a fraction. 30 seconds. The sword drops an inch. A full minute. She blinks. And then she actually sees him. A skinny boy in a dirty shirt with no weapon and no armor and no reason to be this calm except that he has already died once, and the second time around, fear tastes different. She says something in a language he has never heard and somehow understands. "Where is this?" He answers. "Somewhere safe." She touches the rough fabric on her shoulders and asks the only question that matters. "Why did you cover me?" He thinks about it for 1 second. "Because you were shaking." and something shifts behind her eyes. Not trust. Not yet. Just the faintest possibility that trust might one day exist. Her name is Saerin, 18. 2 days ago, her entire clan burned on the northern plains. She fought for 40 hours straight, killed 19, watched her mother burn inside a tent, watched her brother take an arrow through the eye. The altar snatched her at the exact moment she raised her sword for one last suicide charge against 60 riders. She was supposed to die in that charge. Instead, she is here, next to a boy who gave her his only warm thing. He leads her to his hut on the eastern edge of the village. Leaking roof, dirt floor, one straw mat. A door that bars from inside. She walks in and sits against the far wall with the sword across her knees and drinks half a jug of water without breathing. He says he will be right outside. He closes the door. Outside, the night comes fast, under stars he does not recognize. He sits against the wall and looks at his thin, useless hands. No calluses, no magic, no money, no food past tomorrow. Inside the hut, a girl sleeps against a wall because every wall she ever leaned on was eventually knocked down. He understands that with a precision that surprises him. Not because he fought wars, because he knows what it is like to sit in a room where nobody is coming. He did it for 12 years in Incheon. And here is the rule of the altar. 1 person per day, pulled from the worst moment of their life. He cannot choose who. He cannot send them back. If they die here, they are gone forever. Which means every single person it gives him is irreplaceable. Every single one matters completely. And right now, he has one. 1 girl, 1 sword, 1 hut with a leaking roof. Tomorrow, at sunset, there will be another. Another person falling out of the worst day of their life. And he needs to have a bowl of hot food ready. Because that is what you do. When someone falls, you catch them. When they are cold, you give them your cloak. When they are hungry, you feed them. Not because it is strategic, because it is right. And because he spent 28 years learning exactly what it feels like when nobody does any of those things. He falls asleep against the wall of a hut in a world that is not his own, with no power and no plan and no guarantee of tomorrow. But for the first time in either of his lives, he is not alone. And that is the only number that matters. Morning came with a rooster that sounded like it was being murdered. Taehyeon opened his eyes and for 3 full seconds did not know where he was. The sky was pink. The air was cold. His back ached from sleeping against the wall. Then the memories settled into place like files loading on an old computer, and he remembered everything. New world, no system. Girl with a sword inside the hut. Empty stomach. No plan past breakfast. He stood up and stretched. His joints popped in 4 places. This body was young, but it had been neglected. The original Taehyeon had not eaten well. His arms were thin as sticks, and his legs felt like they might snap if he ran too hard. First priority, food. He checked the hut. The door was still barred from inside, which meant Saerin was still in there. He did not knock. If she had slept at all after what she went through, then letting her sleep was worth more than any conversation. He walked around the hut to the small yard behind it. The original Taehyeon's possessions were minimal. A wooden bucket, a clay pot with a crack in it, a dull knife that was technically legal for a hollow to own because it was shorter than a forearm, a pile of firewood that was mostly damp, a small pouch of millet that might last 2 meals for 1 person. This was the entire inventory. In a game, this would be the tutorial screen. The part where the system gives you 3 sticks and says, good luck. He picked up the knife and tested the edge. Dull, but functional. He could work with dull. He could not work with nothing. The village of Saerin was already stirring. He could hear voices down the main road and the clank of someone working metal. The smithy. He filed that information. A working smithy meant a blacksmith, which meant someone who understood fire and iron and tools. Useful. But not yet. Right now, he needed protein. The millet would keep them alive for 1 more day, But millet alone would not sustain 2 people, let alone 3 or 4 or however many the altar decided to throw at him. He needed meat. He walked toward the northern tree line where the forest began. The memories of this body told him the forest was called barren wood, shallow on the edges, dense in the middle. Wolves in winter, but it was late spring now, so mostly rabbits and pheasants and the occasional deer. Rabbits. He could work with rabbits. In his old life, he had spent one lunch break watching a YouTube video about primitive snare traps because the algorithm had decided that was what he needed that day. He had watched it twice because it was genuinely interesting. The design was simple. A bent sapling, a trigger stick, a loop of cord. When the animal stepped on the trigger, the sapling snapped upright and the loop caught the leg. He did not have cord, but he had seen the back of the hut. There were strips of old leather from what looked like a broken harness, dry and stiff, but still strong enough. He went back and cut 4 strips with the knife, each one about the length of his arm. He tied loops at the ends using a slip knot he remembered from a camping trip he took alone 3 years before his death. A camping trip where he had sat by a fire for 2 days and talked to no one, and somehow still called it a vacation. She looked different in daylight, taller than he expected, lean like a whip with long arms and wide shoulders for a woman. The scar across her left eyebrow was a clean, straight line. A blade had done that. Her hair was dark brown and tangled, and she had tried to finger comb it without much success. She was still holding the sword. Her eyes scanned the area around the hut in a practiced sweep, left to right, tree line, road, buildings, exits. She was mapping threats. Taehyeon had seen security consultants do the same thing at corporate events. She saw him and stopped scanning. Her expression was flat, not hostile, not friendly, just assessing. He raised one hand in a simple wave. She did not wave back. He walked to the fire pit in front of the hut, 3 stones in a circle with old ash in the middle. He arranged the driest pieces of firewood he could find and used the knife and a flat stone to strike sparks onto a handful of dried grass. It took 20 tries. His hands were shaking from the cold and from having no calories in his system. On the 21st try, the grass caught, and he blew gently until the flame spread to the wood. He set the cracked clay pot over the fire with water from the bucket and added the millet. It would be thin, barely porridge, more like flavored water, but it would be warm. Saerin watched all of this without a word. When the millet was cooked, he scooped half into a wooden bowl he found inside the hut and handed it to her. She looked at the bowl, then at him, then at the pot where his half was still sitting. She could see the math, half for her, half for him, and the pot was not large. He ate his portion standing up because there was only one bowl. He drank it straight from the pot after it cooled enough not to burn his lips. It tasted like nothing, warm nothing. But it was food, and his stomach stopped hurting. Saerin ate slowly, each bite deliberate. She was rationing out of habit. This was a person who had known hunger before. When she finished, she set the bowl down and finally spoke. She asked him what he expected from her. The question was direct and practiced. She had said it before, to other people. People who had wanted things from her. Her sword, her strength, her body, her obedience. Taehyeon looked at her and considered several answers. The strategic answer was that he needed her combat skills to survive. The honest answer was simpler. He told her he expected nothing. He told her that she could leave whenever she wanted. The door was not locked. The road went south to the nearest town and north into the forest. He would not stop her, and he would not follow her. She was not his prisoner, or his soldier, or his servant. She was a person who had fallen, and he had caught her, and now she could choose what to do with her own feet. Saerin stared at him for a long time. Then she asked what he planned to do. Not what he expected from her, what he planned. The shift was subtle, but Taehyeon caught it. She was considering staying. Not committing, just considering. He told her he planned to eat better tomorrow. That was the entire plan. She almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth moved a fraction of an inch and then stopped. It was the saddest almost smile he had ever seen. They checked the snares before noon. 3 of 4 had been triggered. 2 held rabbits. 1 had caught a pheasant, which was not how snares were supposed to work, but apparently this pheasant had been having a bad day. Taehyeon held up the pheasant and looked at Saerin. She looked at the bird, then at the snare, then at him. She said that in her world, only master hunters could catch a sky bird in a ground trap. He told her it was probably just a stupid pheasant. She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been buried under so many layers of grief. They cleaned the game together. Saerin knew how to skin and gut an animal faster than Taehyeon could blink. Her knife work was surgical. He set up a spit over the fire, and they roasted the rabbits while the pheasant hung from the eaves to dry. The smell of cooking meat drifted across the eastern edge of the village. Within an hour, a small boy appeared at the edge of the yard, maybe 8 years old. Dirty face, bare feet. He stared at the roasting rabbits with eyes that were too large for his head. Taehyeon recognized that look. Not want. Need. He cut a leg off the first rabbit and held it out. The boy ran forward and grabbed it and ran away without a word. 10 minutes later, a woman appeared. Thin, hollow cheeks. She stood at the edge of the yard and did not come closer. She told him the boy was hers. She apologized for his rudeness. Taehyeon told her there was nothing to apologize for. He asked her name. He looked at Saerin, who was sitting by the fire cleaning her sword. She felt something too, because she looked up at the same moment. She could not see the words, but she could feel the vibration in the air. Her hand went to her sword hilt. Taehyeon said, "Accept." The air tore open again. Same ugly, jagged tear. Same blackness behind it. This time what fell through was smaller. A girl, young, maybe 15. She hit the ground hard and rolled. She was wearing a leather apron over a cotton shirt that was singed at the edges. Her hair was short and black and uneven, like she had cut it herself with scissors in the dark. She wore round spectacles that were cracked on the left lens. She was coughing. Smoke. She smelled like smoke and hot metal and machine oil. In her arms she clutched something, a rolled-up piece of paper. She held it the way Saerin held her sword, like the last thing she owned in the world. Taehyeon crouched down. The girl looked up at him through her cracked spectacles. Her eyes were red from smoke and crying. She was shaking worse than Saerin had been. This was not a warrior who had gone down fighting. This was a child who had been thrown out. He took off his cloak again. It was the same cloak from yesterday, because he only had one. He draped it over her shoulders. She flinched. Then she grabbed the edges of the cloak and pulled it tight around herself like armor. Saerin appeared next to him. She looked at the girl, then at Taehyeon. Then she walked inside the hut and came back with the clay pot of water. She held it out to the girl. The girl drank. Taehyeon watched Saerin do this and filed it away. Yesterday she had been the one drinking. Today she was the one offering. That was fast. Faster than he expected. People who have been given kindness for the first time either hoard it or pass it on. Saerin was a passer. Good. He would remember that. The girl's name was Yoona, 15, from a world of steam engines and coal fires and brass gears. Daughter of a chief engineer at a factory that built locomotive engines. She had inherited her father's gift for machines, but not his gender. At 12, she had redesigned the valve timing on a main boiler and increased efficiency by 14%. Her father took credit. At 13, she corrected a flaw in a bridge blueprint that would have caused a collapse. Her supervisor took credit. At 14, she built a working miniature turbine from scrap parts on the factory floor. The foreman took credit, and then fired her for being in the factory unsupervised. At 15, her father disowned her publicly to save face. She had been standing on the roof of the factory, looking at the ground 30 meters below, when the air tore open behind her. She was not holding a weapon. She was holding a blueprint. The rolled paper in her arms was the design for a water recycling system she had been working on for 2 years. The last thing she ever made. Taehyeon listened to all of this while Saerin stood behind him with her arms crossed and her eyes hard. Not hard at Yoona. Hard at the world Yoona had come from. When Yoona finished talking, she looked at Taehyeon and asked the same question Saerin had asked that morning. What did he expect from her? He thought about it. Then he asked her a question instead. He asked her if the water recycling design actually worked. She blinked. No one had ever asked her about the design. They had asked about her behavior, her attitude, her place, her gender. No one had asked about the work. She unrolled the blueprint on the ground. It was covered in precise technical drawings in a notation system he did not recognize, but the logic was clear. Intake, filter, cistern, gravity feed, return loop. It was a closed water system for an industrial boiler that could be adapted with almost no changes to work as a village water supply. He stared at it for a full minute. Then he looked up at her and said 4 words. "Yoona, you are brilliant." She burst into tears. That night, 3 of them sat around the fire. Saerin on the left with her sword across her knees. Yoona on the right, wrapped in the cloak with her blueprint on her lap. Taehyeon in the middle, poking the fire with a stick. They ate pheasant, not much, a third each. But it was hot and real, and they ate together, which made it taste better than it was. Taehyeon looked at his 2 companions and began thinking, not about survival, about systems. He had a swordswoman who could fight and hunt. He had an engineer who could build and design. He had himself in 12 years of managing people in logistics and supply chains. In a strategy game, this would be 3 unique units with complementary skills. The question was not whether they could survive. 3 days passed and the hut already looked different. Yoona had rebuilt the door frame using scrap wood from an abandoned cart she found behind the tavern. The hinges were leather strips soaked in animal fat to keep them flexible. The door now closed properly for the first time in what was probably years. Saerin had cleared a section of bamboo grove at the river bend. 40 stalks cut clean at the base in under 2 hours. Her sword work was fast and precise, and she did not waste a single swing. Taehyeon carried the stalks back to the hut in bundles of 5. His shoulders burned after the first trip. After the 8th trip, he could barely lift his arms. But the bamboo was stacked, and Yoona was already splitting them lengthwise and fitting them end to end with clay seals she made from river mud and ash. By the evening of the 3rd day, water flowed from the river to a clay basin behind the hut through 40 meters of bamboo pipe. It was not clean water. It was river water with sediment and probably things living in it that Taehyeon did not want to think about. But it was water that arrived at their door without anyone carrying it. Yoona stood next to the basin and watched the water trickle in with an expression of absolute concentration. Then she adjusted one joint where the seal was leaking. Then she adjusted another. Then she stepped back and looked at the whole system, and for the first time since she arrived, she smiled. It was a small, tight smile, like she was afraid it might be taken away if she made it too big. Taehyeon stood next to her and said nothing about the smile. He just looked at the water and said it was good work. She adjusted her cracked spectacles and said it was adequate. He said adequate was a start. She smiled again, slightly bigger this time. On the 4th day at sunset, the 3rd companion arrived. Her name was Lien, 22 years old, tall, pale skin, long hair the color of straw. She came through the tear in the air not violently like Saerin or coughing like Yoona, but slowly, almost gently. She stepped through as if walking through a doorway in a dream. Her robes were white and embroidered with symbols that glowed faintly. A healer, a priestess. She looked around the yard with calm, gray eyes and showed no fear. Then she looked at Taehyeon and looked at Saerin standing behind him with a sword and looked at Yoona peering out from behind the hut with wide eyes, and she said one word. "Hello." Taehyeon offered her the cloak. She declined politely. She was not cold. She was not injured. She was not shaking. She was simply sad. The kind of sad that does not scream or cry or fall apart. The kind that sits behind the eyes like a permanent resident. He asked her what happened. She told him calmly. She was a healer priestess of the Temple of the Silver Flame. She had served for 12 years. She healed anyone who came to the temple doors, regardless of which side they fought for, or which god they prayed to, or what crime they had committed. This was her interpretation of her vows. The temple disagreed. When enemy soldiers came to her door bleeding, she healed them. The temple called it treason. When condemned prisoners were brought to her in chains, she healed them. The temple called it heresy. When she refused to stop, they tried her, found her guilty, sentenced her to burn. She had been standing in the center of a pyre with flames climbing her robes when the air opened and she stepped through. She told this story the way someone describes the weather. Matter of fact, distant, like it had happened to someone else. Taehyeon recognized that distance. It was the same distance he used to feel when coworkers asked how his weekend was, and he said fine, because explaining that he spent 48 hours alone in a studio apartment eating delivery rice and playing Crusader Kings would have required energy he did not have. Lean was not fine. She was broken in a way that did not show on the outside, because the break was in her faith, not her body. She had healed in the name of a god. That night, 4 people slept under one roof for the first time. Saerin against the north wall. Lean against the south wall. Yoona in the corner with her blueprint rolled under her head like a pillow. Taehyeon outside against the wall again, because there was not enough room inside, and because he had decided that the women would always have the shelter first. His back was getting used to the wall. He was starting to think of it as his spot. The stars were out. The altar on the hill was silent. He could feel the hum in his chest, already counting down to tomorrow's sunset. One more person. Every day, one more. He needed more food, more space, more materials, more allies. He needed the village to stop seeing him as the hollow boy and start seeing him as the man who made things work. He needed the smithy, the old kuznech, the one whose wife Min he had been feeding. Tomorrow he would visit, not to ask for anything, just to introduce himself, and to bring a rabbit. Morning of day 5. Taehyeon walked to the smithy with a cleaned rabbit on a stick, and Saerin 3 steps behind him, because she refused to let him walk anywhere alone. The smithy was a stone building with a thatched roof and a chimney that leaked smoke from 3 different holes. The forge inside was cold. A man sat on a stool outside, staring at nothing. Big hands, big arms, hollow eyes. This was Korgan, the village blacksmith. His son had died 2 months ago from a fever that the nearest healer could not be bothered to treat because Saerin was too far from anywhere important. Since then, Korgan had not lit the forge. Min had been feeding the family on washing and whatever scraps she could get. Taehyeon walked up to Korgan and held out the rabbit. Korgan looked at him, then at the rabbit, then at Saerin behind him, and her sword. Walking back to the hut, Saerin was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that stopped Taehyeon in his tracks. She said in her world, when a warrior received a forged blade from a smith, it meant the smith had pledged his fire to the warrior's cause. She said Korgan had just made himself their first vassal and did not even know it. Taehyeon looked at the smithy behind them. Smoke was rising from the chimney. The forge was lit. For the first time in 2 months. He thought about what Saerin said. Then he corrected her gently. Korgan was not their vassal. Korgan was their first ally. There was a difference. Vassals served because they had to. Allies stayed because they chose to. Saerin considered this. Then she nodded once. It was the first time she had accepted something he said without argument. Progress. The days folded into each other. Day 6 brought the 4th companion, a girl named Hana who could speak to plants. Day 7 brought the 5th, a girl named Duri who could forge barriers of light. Taehyeon fed them, clothed them in whatever spare fabric he could scrounge, gave them places in the hut that was becoming increasingly crowded. Saerin organized a watch rotation without being asked. Yoona began sketching an expansion plan for the hut using local timber. Lien started walking into the village each morning, offering to heal minor ailments for free. The first day, no one came. The second day, a woman brought her daughter with a burned hand. Lien healed it in seconds. By the end of the week, there was a line outside the hut every morning. Taehyeon watched this from his spot by the wall, and felt something he had not felt in either of his lives. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of watching a machine begin to work. Gears engaging. Pieces fitting. A system coming alive. He was building something. Not a kingdom. Not yet. Something smaller and more important. A place where people chose to stay. By the end of the second week, the hut was no longer a hut. Yoona had drawn up plans on the third day after her arrival, and Taehyeon had approved them on the fourth, and by the 10th day, they had a compound. The word was generous. It was really 4 structures, built from salvaged timber and river clay, arranged in a square around a central yard. The main building slept 6 on raised wooden platforms that kept them off the damp ground. A second building served as a kitchen and storage. A third was Lien's healing station. The fourth was Yoona's workshop, where she spent every waking hour she was not eating or sleeping. The compound was surrounded by a waist-high fence of sharpened stakes. Not a real fortification, more of a statement. This is ours. This has an edge. Saerin had insisted on the stakes and had spent 2 full days cutting and placing them with a focus that bordered on obsessive. She walked the perimeter every morning and every evening, counting the stakes. All 56. Always 56. If one was leaning, she straightened it. If one was cracked, she replaced it. Taeyeon understood. It was not about defense. It was about having a boundary that she controlled. Something between her and the world that stayed where she put it. The companions were settling into roles, not because Taeyeon assigned them, because he watched and listened and then put each person where they naturally fit. This was the one-on-one meeting approach. Every evening after dinner, he sat with each companion for 10 minutes. Just 10. He asked them 3 questions. What did you do today? What was hard? What do you need? Most of them did not know how to answer the third question. They had never been asked it before. Saerin said she needed nothing every single time. Then on the 8th evening, she said she needed a place to train where she would not scare Yoona with her sword drills. By the next morning, Taeyeon had marked out a training ground east of the compound, between 2 large trees. He had cleared the brush himself before dawn. When Saerin saw it, she stood at the edge of the cleared ground and said nothing for a full minute. Then she walked in and drew her sword and began moving through forms. She trained for 3 hours straight, and when she came back, her eyes were clearer than he had ever seen them. Yoona said she needed better tools. Her fingers were raw from working with improvised implements. Taehyeon went to Korgan and asked if the smith had any spare chisels or files he could trade for. Korgan reached under his workbench and pulled out a leather roll of 6 hand tools. Chisels, a small hammer, a file, a pair of tongs. He said his son had been learning the trade, and these were his practice tools. He said they were collecting dust. He said take them. Taehyeon brought them to Yoona and said they were hers. She unrolled the leather and touched each tool individually. Then she carefully rolled them back up and held the bundle against her chest. Lien was different. When he asked her what she needed, she said she needed to be useful. Not in a desperate way, in a quiet, factual way. She needed her hands to do what they were made for. Healing was not just her skill, it was her identity. Without it, she was the woman who stood on a pyre and did not burn. With it, she was Lien. Taeyeon told her that the village had no healer, and that people were already lining up at the compound every morning. He said the healing station was hers. Not the compound's, not his. Hers. He would have Yoona build a sign if she wanted one. Lien said she did not need a sign. People who needed healing could find her. She was right. Within 2 weeks, every person in Saerin knew where to go when their child had a fever, or their back went out, or their cow had a swollen leg. Lien healed them all, humans and animals alike. She did not discriminate. That was the whole point. Hana, the 4th companion, was quiet and strange. She had been summoned from a world where people bonded with plants the way others bonded with animals. She could touch a seed and feel whether the soil was right. She could press her palm against a tree and know if it was sick. She could not make plants grow faster or conjure forests from nothing. Her ability was understanding. She knew what plants needed. Taehyeon gave her the fields south of the compound and said, "Do whatever you think is right." Hana spent 3 days walking every row of the village fields. She came back and told him that the farmers of Saerin had been planting the same crop in the same soil for at least 20 years without rotation. The earth was exhausted. The yields were a third of what they should be. She drew a rotation plan on the ground with a stick. Grain in the south fields this season. Legumes in the north to fix nitrogen in the soil. Fallow the east. Root vegetables in the west. Rotate every season. Taehyeon looked at the plan and felt a familiar click in his brain. Crop rotation. He knew about this. Every strategy game had a food production mechanic, and the efficient ones always involved rotation. He told Hana her plan was exactly right and asked her to present it to the village farmers. She looked terrified. She had never spoken to a group before. He said he would be there with her. The meeting happened the next day in the village square. 8 farmers showed up. Hana spoke in a voice so quiet that the farmers in the back had to lean forward. But what she said was clear and specific and backed by knowledge none of them had. When she finished, the oldest farmer, a man named Gol, with a face like dried leather, asked her how she knew all this. Hana said she could feel it in the soil. Gol stared at her. Then he looked at Taehyeon. He asked if the hollow boy was vouching for this girl. Taehyeon said he was. Gol spat on the ground. Then he said, "Fine." He would try the rotation on his east field. If it worked by harvest, he would tell the others. If it failed, he would come break something of Taehyeon's. Taehyeon said that was fair. They shook on it. Duri, the 5th companion, was the opposite of Hana in every way. Loud. Restless. She paced like a caged animal, and her light barriers flickered when she was agitated, which was most of the time. She had been summoned from a world at war where she served as a shield bearer. Her job was to stand in front of other people and take the hits. She was covered in scars. Not sword scars like Saerin. Burn scars. Impact scars. The marks of someone who had absorbed damage meant for others for years until her body was a map of other people's survival. Her barrier ability was powerful. She could project a wall of solid golden light about 3 meters wide and 2 meters tall. It could stop arrows and blades and even light magic, but it could not stop everything, and every scar was a time it had not been enough. Taehyeon asked her what she needed. She said she needed to stand between him and danger. He said there was no danger right now. She said there would be. She was right about that. The first trouble came on day 16. A group of 5 men walked into the compound yard at midday without invitation. They wore leather vests over chain shirts and carried short swords at their hips. The leader was a thick-necked man with a beard that looked like it had been in several fights of its own. He said he was Revik. He said he worked for the local tax collector, who worked for Baron Kelst, who owned everything within 3 days' ride of Saerin, including Saerin itself. He said the Baron had heard that a hollow boy was building structures on land that belonged to the crown. He said this was illegal. He said the hollow boy had 3 days to tear everything down and present himself to the Baron's court for sentencing. He said this with a smile that showed missing teeth. Taehyeon stood in the center of the yard with his hands at his sides. Saerin was behind him. Her sword was drawn. Duri was to his left. Her light barrier was flickering at her fingertips, ready to deploy. Yoona was in her workshop doorway, holding a hammer like she intended to use it on something other than metal. Lien stood at the healing station entrance. Even Hana had come from the fields and was standing near the gate with dirt on her knees and anger in her eyes. 6 women and 1 skinny boy against 5 armed men. Revik looked at the women. His smile widened. He made a comment about the hollow boy's private collection. He said the Baron might be interested in inspecting the merchandise. Saerin stepped forward. 1 step. Just 1. But the way she moved changed the air in the yard. It went from tense to lethal in the span of that single step. Revik's smile died. He looked at Saerin, and whatever he saw in her eyes made him take his hand off his sword hilt. Not because he was a coward, because he was experienced enough to know what a killer looked like, and Saerin looked like 19 kills and a willingness to make it 20. Taehyeon raised his hand. Saerin stopped. He looked at Revik and spoke calmly. He said he understood the Baron's concern. He said the structures were temporary shelters for displaced persons, which was permitted under crown law even on baronial land, as long as no permanent foundations were laid. He knew this because he had spent 2 hours the previous night reading a water-damaged copy of Hairan's property statutes that Chizia— No, he did not have Chizia yet. He knew this because Yoona had found the book in the abandoned cart she had salvaged for parts, and Taehyeon had read it cover to cover because reading legal documents before bed was a habit from his old life that apparently transcended death and rebirth. Revik blinked. He had not expected the Hollow Boy to cite law. He asked where the boy learned to read. Taehyeon ignored the question and continued. He said the tax on temporary shelters was 4 coppers per structure per season. He reached into his belt and pulled out 16 copper coins. Exactly 4 structures times 4 coppers. He had earned the coins over the past week by selling surplus rabbit pelts to a traveling merchant who passed through Saerin every 10 days. He had planned for this moment. He held out the coins. Revik stared at them. He stared at Taehyeon. He took the coins slowly. Then he counted them. Then he pocketed them. He told the Hollow Boy that the Baron would hear about this. Taehyeon said he hoped so. Revik and his men left. When they were out of sight, Duri's barrier vanished and she sat down on the ground, hard. Her hands were shaking. Saerin sheathed her sword and walked to the perimeter to count her stakes. Yoona went back to her workshop. Lian went inside to make tea. Taehyeon stood in the yard alone for a moment and let out a breath he had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. Then he went to his evening one-on-ones, because the schedule did not change just because armed men showed up. By the end of the first month, the compound had a name. Taehyeon did not choose it. The villagers did. They called it the Eastern Court, because it sat on the eastern edge of Saerin, and because the Hollow Boy who ran it held meetings in the yard like a lord held court. Taehyeon thought the name was premature. It was still just 4 buildings and a fence. But names had power, and once people started using one, it stuck. He let it stick. 7 companions now. Saerin, Yoona, Lian, Hana, Duri. The 6th was a girl named Finn, who could manipulate thread and fabric at a distance. She had been a seamstress in a world of silk empires, and had been sentenced to lose her hands for sewing a forbidden pattern into a nobleman's cloak. The 7th was a girl named Mira, who could store small amounts of energy in crystals and release them as heat or light. She had been a lamplighter in a world of underground cities, and had been sealed alive in a tunnel collapse. Each one arrived at sunset. Each one arrived broken. Each one got the cloak and the bowl of food and the question, "What do you need?" Taehyeon ran the compound like a project. He did not think of it in those terms out loud because the companions would not understand corporate language. But in his head, every morning began with a stand-up meeting. What did we accomplish yesterday? What are we doing today? What is blocking us? He held the meeting in the yard at dawn. Short, 5 minutes, everyone standing. Saerin reported on security and hunting yields. Yoona reported on construction and tool maintenance. Lian reported on medical cases from the village. Hana reported on the fields. Duri reported on perimeter watch. Fen reported on clothing and textile supplies. Mira reported on energy and lighting. Taehyeon listened to all 7 and then assigned priorities for the day. He never raised his voice. He never gave orders in the military sense. He said things like, "I think it would be good if," and "Could you take a look at," and "What do you think about?" Each phrasing was deliberate. He had learned in his old life that people who felt consulted worked twice as hard as people who felt commanded. It was not a trick. It was respect delivered in the form of a question. The village was changing. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the accumulation of small improvements was becoming visible. Lian had treated 47 patients in 4 weeks. No one had died of a treatable illness since her arrival. Hana's crop rotation had been adopted by 3 of the 8 farmers after Goal's East Field showed visible improvement in just 3 weeks. The soil was darker. The shoots were taller. Goal did not come to break anything. Instead, he came to the compound and asked Hana to look at his north field too. Yoona had improved Corgan's bellows system with a simple lever mechanism that doubled the airflow to the forge. Corgan could now work iron faster and hotter. In exchange, he repaired tools for the compound and forged nails and hinges and brackets that Yoona needed for her projects. The economy was not based on money, it was based on reciprocity. I fix your thing, you fix mine. The village had always operated on some version of this, but it had been informal and unreliable. Taehyeon formalized it. He kept a ledger, a simple notebook made from bark pages sewn together by Fen. In it, he recorded every exchange. Korgan fixed 3 hinges for Yoona. Yoona designed a plow attachment for farmer Gol. Gol gave 2 sacks of grain to Min. Min washed clothes for the compound. Each line connected 2 people. When you drew all the lines together, they formed a web, and at the center of the web sat the Eastern Court. The bathhouse was Yoona's idea, but Taehyun's priority. He had pushed it up the list because hygiene was not a luxury in a world without antibiotics. One infected cut could kill. One waterborne disease could wipe out half the village. The bath was simple, a stone-lined pit fed by the bamboo water system, with a fire underneath to heat the rocks. Yoona designed it. Saerin and Duty dug the pit. Hana lined it with clay. Lien blessed the water, which Taehyun was fairly certain did nothing medically, but made people feel better, which had its own value. The bath opened on day 22. The compound used it first, then Taehyun opened it to the village. Free, no cost. The first day 3 people came, the second day 7. By the end of the week there was a schedule. The bathhouse became the most popular structure in Saerin overnight. People who had not washed properly in months came out of the bath looking like different humans. Children who had been covered in grime were suddenly clean, and their mothers cried because they had forgotten what their children's skin looked like. The old net mender sat in the hot water for an hour and said his back pain was gone for the first time in 10 years. Taehyun watched from the yard and made a note in his ledger. Bathhouse. Week 1. 32 users. 0 complaints. 1 request for soap. He underlined the soap note. Soap was next on the list. He knew how to make it. Fat and ash and water. A YouTube video he watched during a power outage at the office when his phone was the only thing with battery. He had watched it because the algorithm had once again decided it knew what he needed better than he did. For once, the algorithm was right. The morning meetings were getting longer, not because of inefficiency, because there was more to discuss. Taehyun adjusted. He split the meeting into 2, a morning stand-up for daily operations, a weekly review on every 7th day for bigger plans. The weekly review happened in the evening around the fire. All 7 companions attended. He drew maps in the dirt. He used sticks and stones to represent resources and people. He asked each companion for input on their area, what was working, what was not, what they needed. These meetings were not smooth. Saerin and Dury disagreed on patrol routes. Yoona wanted more iron from Korgan, but Korgan's output was limited. Fen needed fabric, but the nearest textile merchant was 3 towns away. Mira's crystals were running low on ambient energy, and she did not know why. Each problem was a bottleneck, and Taehyun treated them exactly the way he had treated supply chain bottlenecks in his old life. Identify the constraint, find the cheapest solution, implement, monitor, iterate. When Saerin and Dury argued about patrol routes, he listened to both plans and then drew a third that incorporated elements of each. When Yoona needed more iron, he sent Saerin to scout the hills east of the village for ore deposits, and she found a small vein on the second day. When Fen needed fabric, he traded preserved rabbit pelts to the traveling merchant for cotton bolts. When Mira's crystals were weak, he asked Lien if healing energy and crystal energy were related, and Lien said she did not know, but she could try. And when she channeled healing light into one of Mira's crystals, it charged to full in seconds. Both women stared at each other, then at Taehyun. He said he just asked a question. They did the work. The first real test came on day 28, not from the Baron, from the road. A family arrived at the village gate, a man, a woman, 2 children. They had been walking for 6 days from a village to the north that had been destroyed by creatures from a rift. Rifts. Taehyun had heard the word from the villagers in fragments, cracks in reality that appeared on the northeastern wastes. Things came out of them. Bad things. The family was half-starved, and the younger child had a wound on his leg that was turning green. Lien saw them first. She did not wait for permission. She walked out to the gate and brought them to the healing station and began working on the child's leg immediately. Taehyeon arranged food and blankets. Saerin stood guard. The father sat on the ground of the healing station and cried without sound, while Lien's hands glowed over his son's leg. The mother held the older child and stared at the compound with eyes that did not believe what they were seeing. Clean water, warm food, a healer who asked no payment. This was not how the world worked, not the world they knew. The child survived. The wound closed over 2 days under Lien's care. The family stayed. Taehyeon gave them a corner of the storage building, and Yoona built a partition. The father's name was Doric. He had been a carpenter before the rift destroyed his village. Taehyeon asked him if he wanted work. Doric said he would work for food and shelter. Taehyeon said he would get food and shelter regardless, but if he wanted to build things, there was plenty to build. Doric stared at him. Then he picked up a hammer and went to work. Within 3 days, he had reinforced every joint in the compound. His work was clean and precise, professional. Yoona watched him work with open admiration and peppered him with questions about load-bearing and timber joining that he answered with the patient detail of a man who loved his craft. Another gear engaging, another piece fitting. The machine was growing. Word traveled, not fast, not dramatically, just the slow, steady spread of truth from mouth to mouth. There was a place in Saerin where the Hollow Boy took in anyone, where the healer fixed your child for free, where the water was clean and the food was shared, and nobody asked what system you had or whether you had one at all. 2 more families arrived by the end of the week. Then a lone man with a broken arm. Then a woman with 3 goats and nowhere to graze them. Taehyeon took them all. He fed them. He healed them. He gave them work. He wrote their names in the ledger. 41 people now lived in or around the Eastern Court. 41 names. He knew every single one. The evening of day 30, 1 month since his arrival. Taehyeon stood on the hill next to the altar and looked down at the valley. The sun was setting, orange and gold again. Below him, the Eastern Court was lit with small fires and Mira's crystal lanterns. He could hear voices, laughter, Yoona arguing with Doric about the correct angle for a roof beam, Saerin barking commands at Duri during evening training, Lien humming while she prepared bandages, Hana talking to the goats, Fen mending a shirt by the fire, children running between buildings. A month ago, this had been a broken hut and a boy with dirt in his mouth. He did not feel pride. Pride was dangerous. It made you stop looking at the supply chain. He felt something more useful, momentum. The same feeling he got in Frostpunk when the city stopped dying and started growing, when the meters went green and the people stopped complaining and you could finally start building the thing you actually wanted to build instead of just surviving. The altar hummed behind him. Sunset. The words appeared. Daily companion summon. Ready. Accept. He said accept. The air tore open, and what fell through this time made him take a step back. She was tall. Taller than Saerin. She wore armor that was not leather or chain, but something else entirely. Plate. Full plate. Dented and scratched and missing pieces, but unmistakably military grade. Her hair was black with a streak of gray at the left temple. She had the build of someone who had spent her entire life carrying weight. Not fat, muscle and bone, and the kind of density that comes from years of marching in armor. She hit the ground on one knee, not falling, landing, like she had jumped from a height on purpose. Her eyes were open and clear and absolutely empty. Not shocked, not afraid, not sad. Empty in the way a weapon is empty when it has been fired so many times the barrel is smooth. She looked at Taehyeon. She looked at the altar. She looked at the village below. Then she stood up. Full height. She was a head taller than him. She looked down at him and spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being poured over iron. She told him her name was Marin. She told him she was 30. She told him she had commanded 12,000 soldiers across 3 campaigns and won 2 of them. She told him the third campaign had ended 6 hours ago when her king ordered her executed for losing a battle he had made unwinnable by withholding reinforcements. She told him she was not frightened and she was not grateful and she was not going to cry. She told him that if he wanted her to fight, she would fight, and if he wanted her to leave, she would leave, and either way, she required an honest answer right now about what kind of man he was. Taehyeon looked up at her. Way up. He was a skinny 16-year-old boy in a rough shirt standing in front of a woman who had commanded armies and lost everything and was still standing because sitting down had never occurred to her. He thought about corporate hierarchies, about the time his company hired a retired military officer as VP of operations, and everyone in the office was terrified of her, except Taehyeon, who had simply walked into her office on day one and said, "Welcome to the team," and asked if she preferred her coffee black or with sugar. She had preferred it black. They had gotten along fine after that. He told Marin that he was not a king. He was not a lord. He was a hollow. No system, no army. He had 7 women, and a fence, and a village that was starting to trust him, and a supply chain that was held together with rabbit pelts and goodwill. He said if she wanted to fight, there would be fights eventually, because a man named Baron Kelst was going to come for them, and after the Baron, there would be others. But he said the fighting was not the point. The point was down there. He gestured at the village, the lights, the people, the sound of Yoona arguing about roof angles. He said the point was that place, the place where people could exist without a system deciding their worth. He said he needed someone who knew how to defend a place like that. Not attack, defend. He said he needed someone who could take 7 women with different skills from different worlds and turn them into something that could hold a wall. He said he would give her full command, no conditions, no oversight. Her word would be final in military matters. He said all of this while looking up at her, because he had no choice given the height difference. Marin stared at him for a long time. The setting sun painted her dented armor orange. Then she asked one question. She asked if he meant it. About the full command, no oversight. He said he meant it. She was quiet for another moment. Then something changed in her eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the emptiness filled in slightly. Like a lamp being lit in a dark room. Very dim, but present. She said she would stay. She said she would review his defenses in the morning, and she expected them to be terrible. He said they were. She almost smiled. Almost. It looked painful on her face, like muscles that had forgotten the motion. He gave her the cloak. She looked at it, then at him. She said she did not need a cloak. He said he knew, but it was tradition. She took it and draped it over one shoulder. Not for warmth, as an acknowledgement. Then she walked down the hill toward the eastern court with the stride of a woman who had walked toward things her entire life, regardless of what those things were. Taehyeon stood on the hill alone. The altar was silent again. He looked at his hands, still thin, still useless in a fight, but holding more than they had a month ago. He thought about his old life. Marin did not sleep that first night. She walked every meter of the eastern court perimeter with a torch in one hand and a stick in the other. She used the stick to poke at the ground, test the soil, measure distances. She counted paces between structures. She noted sight lines and blind spots and where the terrain sloped and where it pooled water after rain. By dawn, she had filled 6 bark pages with notes in a cramped, precise hand that looked like military shorthand. Taehyeon found her sitting on a stump near the gate at sunrise. She had not eaten. He brought her a bowl of grain porridge and a strip of dried rabbit. She took both without looking up and ate while reading her notes. He sat down next to her and waited. After 3 minutes, she spoke. She said the eastern court was indefensible. The fence was decorative. The buildings were placed for convenience, not for cover. The sight lines were blocked by Yoona's workshop, which stuck out at the wrong angle. There was no fallback position, no rally point, no stored water inside the perimeter in case the bamboo pipe was cut, no armory, no signal system. If 20 men with swords came over that fence at night, everyone inside would be dead in 4 minutes. She said all of this in the same tone a mechanic uses to list the problems with a broken engine. Not angry, not judging, just accurate. Taehyeon listened to every word. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not say they had done their best with limited resources. He said she was right. Then he asked her what she would do. Marin looked at him sideways. She said most men she had served under would have defended their work, made excuses, told her she did not understand the constraints. He said he understood the constraints perfectly. That was why he was asking her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she unfolded one of the bark pages and began drawing. The plan was simple and brutal in its efficiency. Move Yoona's workshop to the interior. Extend the perimeter fence outward by 10 meters on the north and east sides where the terrain was most exposed. Replace the sharpened stakes with a double row of stakes backed by packed earth. Dig a shallow ditch on the outside, not deep enough to trap a man, just deep enough to break his stride. Build 3 elevated platforms at the corners for watchers. Create a central cistern inside the compound that held enough water for 3 days. Designate one building as an armory and fill it with everything sharp or heavy they had. Establish a signal system using Mira's crystals. Green for normal, red for threat. 3 flashes for assembly. Marin laid out the plan in under 10 minutes. It would take 3 weeks to build with the people they had. She said 3 weeks was too long. Taehyeon said he could make it 2 if she would let Doric lead the construction crew while she focused on training the companions for combat. She considered this. Then she nodded once. Deal. The next 14 days were the hardest the Eastern Court had faced. Every available hand worked from dawn to dusk. Doric led 12 local workers in digging the ditch and moving earth. Yoona designed a new workshop layout that doubled as a defensive structure, with narrow windows that could serve as archer slits. Saerin cut timber for the platforms with a fury that suggested she was imagining each tree was a personal enemy. Duri practiced deploying her light barrier in tight spaces, learning to angle it so it could cover a doorway or a section of wall. Finn wove rope and cord from plant fibers by the kilometer. Mira installed crystal lanterns at every corner and junction tuned to Marin's signal system. Hana kept the fields running and the food growing because an army that was too busy building to eat would collapse in a week. Lien treated the blisters and sprains and pulled muscles that came from people working beyond their limits. Taehyeon did everything else. He carried earth. He hauled timber. He ran messages between work crews. He negotiated with Korgan for more nails and brackets. He kept the ledger updated so that every worker knew what they were owed and every debt was tracked. He slept 4 hours a night and ate standing up, and lost 2 kilos he could not afford to lose. Marin trained the companions every evening after the construction work stopped. She was not gentle. She was not patient. She was precise. She assessed each woman in under 5 minutes and assigned them roles based on what they could actually do, not what they wanted to do. Saerin was the blade, front line, first to engage, last to retreat. Her job was to kill the first 3 attackers fast enough to break the enemy's momentum. Duri was the wall. She stood behind Saerin and deployed her barrier the moment Saerin needed to breathe. The barrier bought time. Time was the most valuable resource in any fight. Hana was support. Not combat support, logistical. She positioned herself at the armory and distributed weapons and supplies to whoever needed them. Mira was signals. She stood on the highest platform and used her crystals to direct movement. Green flash meant advance. Red meant fall back. 2 reds meant rally to the center. Fen was traps. She used her thread ability to string lines across approaches that would tangle feet and trip charges. Lien was medical. She stayed in the central building and healed whoever came through the door. Yoona was engineering. She operated the gate mechanism and any improvised devices she could build in the time they had. Marin herself was command. She stood where she could see the most and gave orders by voice signal and crystal flash. Taehyeon watched the first training session from the edge of the yard. Marin ran them through a scenario. 20 attackers from the north. Night. No warning. Go. It was a disaster. Saerin charged forward before Duri could set her barrier. Mira panicked and flashed the wrong color. Fen's trip lines were set too high, and the imaginary attackers walked under them. Hana froze at the armory door. Yoona jammed the gate. Lien stood in the open calling for wounded when she should have been inside. The only person who performed correctly was Marin herself, who watched the chaos with the expression of a woman who had seen worse. She stopped the exercise after 90 seconds. She did not yell. She did not criticize. She stood in front of them and said one sentence. She said they would do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until their bodies knew what to do before their minds had time to be afraid. Saerin bristled. She said she was not afraid. Marin looked at her and said she knew. She said fear was not the problem. Habit was. When the real attack came, their habits would save them or kill them. Nothing else. Saerin shut her mouth. Coming from another woman who had seen real war, the words carried a weight that Taehyeon's could not. They ran the drill every evening for 12 days. By the 8th day, they could respond to the night attack scenario in under 30 seconds. Saerin and Duri moved as a pair. Mira's signals were clean. Fen's lines were at ankle height, where they belonged. Hana distributed supplies without hesitation. Yoona's gate worked. Lien stayed inside. On the 10th day, Marin added a second scenario, attack from two sides simultaneously. This broke them again. Saerin could not be in two places. Duri's barrier could only face one direction. The solution came from Yoona of all people. She designed a rotating mount for one of the platform watchtowers that let Mira spin in place and signal all four directions without repositioning. She also built a second gate on the south side so defenders could move between sectors without climbing over the wall. Marin looked at the modifications and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said Yoona should have been an engineer in her army. Yoona adjusted her cracked spectacles and said she was an engineer in every army. She just had not found one worth building for. Marin's mouth twitched. Not a smile, but close. The construction finished on day 13 of the 14-day deadline, 1 day early. The eastern court was transformed. The fence was now a wall, packed earth reinforced with timber and backed by a ditch. 3 watchtowers at the corners, manned in rotation by whoever was not working. A central cistern filled from the bamboo pipe and covered against contamination. An armory stocked with Korgan's work, 14 short swords, 8 spears, 20 arrows that Saerin had taught 2 local boys to fletch. It was not an army, it was not a fortress, but it was no longer a joke. Marin stood at the new gate on the morning of the 14th day and surveyed the result. Taehyeon stood next to her. She said it would hold against 30, maybe 40 if the attackers were undisciplined. Against a professional force of 100 or more, it would buy them an hour, maybe 2. He asked if an hour was enough. She said it depended on what you did with the hour. He said he intended to make sure they never needed to find out. That evening, a new companion arrived. The 9th. A young woman named Saul who could see in complete darkness and move without sound. She had been an assassin in a world of shadow courts and had refused to kill a child. Her handlers had thrown her into a pit and sealed it. She arrived covered in dirt and thin as paper, with eyes that reflected light like a cat. She did not speak for 3 days. On the 4th day, she brought Taeyeon a rabbit she had caught in the dark, with her bare hands, and set it on the table without a word. He said thank you and asked her name. She said soul. He asked what she needed. She said darkness. He gave her the night watch. The Baron's second message arrived on day 45. Not Revik this time. A proper messenger, on a horse, carrying a sealed letter with Baron Kelst's crest. Taeyeon opened it in the yard, with Marin standing behind his right shoulder. The letter was polite, formal, written in the careful language of someone who employed scribes. It said the Baron had been informed of improvements made to the temporary shelters in Saerin. It said these improvements appeared to exceed the definition of temporary. It said the Baron would be sending an assessor to evaluate the structures and determine whether additional fees were required. The assessor would arrive in 10 days. Taehyeon read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Marin. She read it once. She said the assessor was a scout. The Baron was not interested in fees. He was interested in what Taehyeon had built, and how many people were inside, and whether it was worth taking by force. Taehyeon agreed. He asked her what they should do. She said they should show the assessor exactly what they wanted him to see, and nothing more. Over the next 10 days, Taehyeon prepared the Eastern Court for inspection the way a corporate office prepares for an audit. He knew exactly what to show, and exactly what to hide. Yoona's workshop, with its half-finished projects and experimental designs, was locked and disguised as a storage shed. The armory was emptied and restocked with farming tools. The watchtowers were draped with drying laundry to look like elevated clotheslines. Saerin put away her armor and wore a simple dress that she hated visibly. Marin disappeared entirely, spending the day of the assessor's visit on a hunting trip that kept her well away from the compound. Dury and Mira were given the day off in the fields. The Eastern Court on assessment day looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like on paper. A collection of temporary shelters for displaced persons, run by a hollow boy who was very good at catching rabbits. The assessor was a thin man named Pell, with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of touching his collar. He walked through the compound with a clipboard made of thin wood and took notes. He counted structures, 4 permanent-looking buildings. He frowned. Taehyeon explained that the walls were packed earth, which technically counted as semi-permanent under Statute 7 of the Crown Land Use Code, and was therefore taxable at a reduced rate. Month 2 began with rain. Not gentle spring rain, a wall of gray water that fell for 6 straight days and turned every road in Saerin into a river of mud. The ditch around the Eastern Court flooded on the 2nd day. By the 3rd day, the southern wall was softening as the packed earth absorbed water faster than it could drain. Yoona spent 72 hours in the rain rebuilding the drainage system. She dug channels with her bare hands when the tools were too slow. Taehyeon ordered her inside twice. She ignored him twice. On the 4th day, he went out in the rain himself and worked next to her in silence until the channels were done. They came back inside, soaked to the bone and shaking.
Lean wrapped them both in blankets and fed them hot broth, and told Taeyeon that leading by example was admirable, but leading by pneumonia was not. He accepted the criticism. Yoona fell asleep at the workbench, with her head on a half-finished gear assembly. He carried her to her sleeping platform. She weighed almost nothing, like carrying a bundle of sticks wrapped in wet cloth. He set her down and pulled a blanket over her and stood there for a moment, looking at this 15-year-old girl who had been thrown away by her own world for the crime of being brilliant. Then he went back outside to check the drainage. The rain brought refugees. 12 people arrived during the storm week. 3 families from villages to the north, where the flooding had destroyed homes and fields. A lone old man who had walked for 4 days in the rain, carrying nothing but a wooden box he refused to open. 2 teenage boys who had been turned away from the nearest town because they had no papers and no system. Taehyeon took them all. The compound was not built for this many. 53 people now, with only space designed for 30. Yoona drew up emergency expansion plans on wet bark paper. Doric shook his head at the timeline, but picked up his hammer. Marin reorganized the sleeping arrangements with the efficiency of someone who had run field camps for thousands. She could fit more people into less space than anyone Taehyeon had ever seen. She did it without complaint, and without asking anyone's opinion, because in a crisis, you did not ask. You did. Taehyeon held an emergency meeting on the evening of the 6th rain day. All companions, plus Doric and Korgan, who had become unofficial advisors. The situation was straightforward. They had food for 10 days at current consumption. The fields were waterlogged and would not produce for at least a month. The snare lines were flooded and useless. The stored grain was running low. The river was too swollen for fishing. He laid out the numbers on the dirt floor of the main building, using stones for people and sticks for food. The math was ugly.
Saerin said they should reduce rations. Taehyeon said no. He said the moment you cut rations, you told people that the system was failing, and that created panic. And panic ate more resources than hunger. Instead, he proposed 3 things. First, send a hunting party into the deep forest where the higher ground meant less flooding. Saerin and Seoul would lead it. Second, trade with the neighboring village of Turin, 3 hours south, which sat on higher ground and likely had surplus grain. He would go himself, with Fen, and enough rabbit pelts and trade goods to fill 2 carts. Third, ask Hana to assess whether any of the waterlogged fields could be salvaged with emergency drainage. 3 parallel solutions for 1 problem. Spread the risk. The hunting party left at dawn. Saerin and Seoul moved through the forest like 2 different kinds of silence. Saerin was the silence of a blade in its sheath. Controlled. Ready. Seoul was the silence of something that was never there at all. She could stand in the shadow of a tree, and Taehyeon would look directly at her and not see her until she moved. Together they brought back 3 deer and a boar within 2 days. Enough meat for a week if it was preserved properly. Finn showed them how to smoke the meat, using a technique from her world, where silk workers preserved food for long journeys. The smokehouse was built in an afternoon, from wet wood and river stones. It was ugly, and it leaked, and it worked. Taehyon's trade mission to Turan was less successful. The village headman was a cautious man named Dosk, who looked at Taehyeon the way a shopkeeper looks at a beggar, with suspicion and the certainty that this interaction would cost him something. Taehyeon offered rabbit pelts and a bolt of Finn's woven fabric for 2 carts of grain. Dosk said the price was too low. Taehyeon offered to add Yoona's bellows design, which would double the efficiency of Turan's smithy. Dosk said he did not trust designs from a hollow boy's workshop. Taehyeon asked Dosk what he needed, not what he wanted to sell, what he needed. Dosk was quiet for a long moment. Then he said his well was running dry. The water table had shifted after the rains, and he did not have anyone who understood water systems. Taehyeon said he had someone who did. He said Yoona could assess the well and design a fix in exchange for the grain. Dosk looked skeptical, but his village needed water more than it needed suspicion. He agreed. They shook on it. Yoona went to Turan 2 days later with Duri as escort. She spent 1 day examining the well and the surrounding terrain. She came back with a plan. The water table had not shifted. The well shaft had cracked underground, and water was seeping into the surrounding soil instead of rising to the surface. The fix was simple. Seal the crack with a mixture of clay and heated pitch. Redirect the seepage back into the shaft with a collar of stones. 1 day of work, 3 workers. Done. Dask got his water. Taehyeon got his grain. And more importantly, Turan now had a reason to think of the Eastern Court as useful rather than threatening. 1 ally village was worth more than 100 swords. The rain stopped on day 7. The sun came out like it had been hiding behind the clouds, waiting for the right moment to make an entrance. The fields steamed, the roads began to dry, and the Eastern Court had survived its first crisis without losing a single person. Taehyeon noted this in the ledger. Rain week, 0 casualties, 12 new residents, 1 trade alliance with Turan. Food supply stabilized at 14 days. He looked at the numbers and allowed himself 3 seconds of satisfaction. Then he turned the page and started planning the next week. The 10th companion arrived that evening, then the 11th the next day, then the 12th. 3 in 3 days. It was the first time the pace felt overwhelming. Each one needed attention. Each one had trauma. Each one needed the cloak and the bowl and the question. Taehyeon felt the strain for the first time. Not physical, emotional. The 10th was a girl named Kale who could manipulate fire but was terrified of it because she had accidentally burned her own village as a child. The 11th was a woman named Yuki who could create illusions but had been enslaved by a warlord who used her to deceive enemy generals. The 12th was a girl named Bryn, who could strengthen any material she touched, but had been chained to a forge and forced to enhance weapons for an army she despised. Each one arrived at sunset. Each one fell. Each one looked at Taehyeon with eyes that asked the same question. Is this another cage? He answered it the same way every time, with a cloak and a bowl and 10 minutes of listening. But 12 people in 12 days meant 12 stories of pain and 12 needs he had to track and 12 faces he had to remember to check on every single day. His calendar in his head was getting crowded. He was starting to mix up names. He was starting to forget who needed what. He was starting to feel like the office manager he used to be 3 months before his death, when the workload exceeded his capacity, and he started staying late and eating at his desk and forgetting to go home. Leon noticed first. She always noticed. She came to him one evening when he was sitting alone, reviewing the ledger, and sat down next to him without speaking. After a minute, she asked when he had last eaten a full meal. He could not remember. She asked when he had last slept more than 4 hours. He could not remember. She asked when he had last sat still without working on something. He opened his mouth to answer and realized there was no answer. She put her hand on his arm. Her healing light was warm, not treating a wound, just warmth. She told him that a healer who did not rest became a patient. She said this applied to whatever he was, too. He asked what he was. She said he was the man who carried them all, and even that man needed to put the weight down sometimes. He sat there for a while, feeling the warmth of her hand and not saying anything. Then he asked her if she would take over the evening check-ins for 3 days. Just 3. She could ask the same 3 questions. What did you do today? What was hard? What do you need? She said she would. He went to bed at sunset for the first time since he arrived and slept for 11 hours straight. He woke up feeling like a different person. Not better exactly. More like a machine that had been rebooted after running too long. He ate breakfast. A full breakfast. Porridge with dried meat and herbs and a cup of something Hana had brewed from forest flowers that tasted like hope made liquid. Then he walked the compound. Not inspecting, not planning, just walking. He stopped at Yoona's workshop and watched her work on a new project. A small hand-cranked device that she said would strip bark from timber 3 times faster than a knife. He stood there for 5 minutes watching her hands move with the precision of a surgeon. She did not notice him until she looked up to grab a tool and jumped when she saw him. She asked if something was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. He said he just wanted to see what she was working on. She stared at him. Then she turned back to the device and explained every component in detail. The crank, the blade angle, the tension spring, the feed mechanism. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she looked at him again. He said it was brilliant. She adjusted her spectacles and said it was adequate. The Baron came in person on day 62, not with an army, with a carriage. 4 black horses and a lacquered wooden box on wheels, with curtains drawn and a driver in livery. An escort of 10 mounted soldiers flanked the carriage. Professional. Armored in chain and plate, with proper helmets and proper swords, and the look of men who had been paid well and often. They rode into Saerin at midday and stopped at the village square. The driver opened the carriage door, and a man stepped out. Baron Kelst was not what Taehyeon expected. He had imagined a fat lord with gold rings and a cruel mouth. The real Baron was lean, 60 years old, clean-shaven, gray hair cut short. He wore a simple dark coat with no visible ornamentation except a silver pin on his collar in the shape of a key. His eyes were sharp and still, and they swept the village square the way Marin's had swept the compound on her first night. Reading, assessing, counting. Taehyeon met him in the square. He went alone. Marin had argued against this for 20 minutes that morning. She said a leader did not walk into a potential threat without escort. He said a leader who hid behind his people told the world he was afraid. She said fear was reasonable. He said reasonable was not the same as useful. She called him a stubborn fool. He said she was correct on both counts.
Then he walked to the square alone, while Marin watched from the compound wall with her jaw clenched and her hand on the spear she had claimed from the armory. The Baron looked at Taehyeon the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is considering buying, with interest but without respect. He said he wanted to see the Eastern Court, not an inspection, not an audit, a visit. He said he had heard interesting things about a hollow boy who built shelters and fed refugees and somehow attracted women the way a lamp attracted moths. He said interesting things concerned him. Taehyeon said he understood the concern. He said the Baron was welcome to visit. He would provide tea. The Baron raised one eyebrow. He said he did not drink tea with hollow boys. Taehyeon said the tea was the same regardless of who drank it. The Baron looked at him for 3 long seconds. Then his mouth twitched, and he said, "Lead the way." Taehyeon walked the Baron through the compound. Not the disguised version he had shown the assessor, the real version. He showed him the wall, the watchtowers, the cistern, the armory, the workshop, the healing station, the bathhouse. He introduced him to Marin, who stood at attention with the expression of a carved statue. He introduced him to Saerin, who kept her hand on her sword the entire time. He introduced him to Yoona, who pushed her spectacles up her nose and stared at the Baron's silver pin with open curiosity. He introduced him to Leon, who offered the Baron a cup of herbal tea, which he declined. He showed him the fields, where Hana's rotation had doubled the yield in 8 weeks. He showed him the ledger, with its careful records of every transaction and exchange and debt and credit in the compound's economy. The Baron read 2 pages of the ledger without speaking. Then he closed it and looked at Taehyeon. He asked where the women came from. Taehyeon said they were displaced persons from various regions. The Baron said that was a diplomatic answer, and he preferred direct ones. Taehyeon said they were summoned by the altar. The Baron's expression did not change. He asked if Taehyeon controlled the altar. Taehyeon said no one controlled the altar. It chose who it chose. The Baron asked what system the altar had given him. Taehyeon said he was hollow, no system. The Baron said a hollow boy did not build what he was looking at. Taehyeon said the hollow boy did not build it alone. The Baron looked around the compound one more time, at the walls, the towers, the people working in organized teams, the clean water system, the smokehouse, the fields. Then he looked at Taehyeon with an expression that was harder to read than Saerin's. He said he had been Baron of this region for 31 years. He said in those 31 years, he had seen lords with full systems and armies of 1,000 fail to build what this boy had built in 2 months. He said this was either genius or a threat, possibly both. He made Taehyeon an offer. The Baron would grant official recognition to the Eastern Court as a licensed settlement under baronial authority. This meant legal protection. No other lord could claim the land. No tax collector could demand fees beyond the standard rate. In exchange, the Eastern Court would provide 3 things: healing services from Lean for the Baron's household, engineering consultation from Yoona for the Baron's infrastructure, and 1 favor to be named later. Taehyeon asked what the favor might be. The Baron said he did not know yet. That was the nature of a favor. It could be small, it could be large. But it would be 1 favor and 1 time only, and after that, the debt was cleared. Marin's jaw tightened. She knew what unnamed favors meant in politics. They were blank checks written on other people's futures. Taehyeon also knew. In his old life, he had seen contracts with vague clauses used to trap vendors into impossible obligations. The smart move was to refuse. The safe move was to refuse. Taehyeon accepted. Marin looked at him with something between shock and fury. He met her eyes and held them. Later. When the Baron left, she cornered him behind the armory. She said he had just sold a piece of their future to a man he did not trust. He said he had not sold anything. He had bought time. The Baron's recognition meant no other lord could legally move against them for at least a year. In that year, Taehyeon could grow. More people, more resources, more companions, more allies. The favor was a risk, but a bounded one. 1 favor, 1 time. Not ongoing servitude, not a permanent tax. Not a military obligation. One request that he could prepare for because he knew it was coming, even if he did not know what it would be. Marin said preparation required knowing the threat. He said preparation required knowing yourself. He said by the time the Baron called in his favor, the Eastern Court would be strong enough to decide whether to honor it or renegotiate from a position of strength. She stared at him. Then she said he thought too far ahead. He said that was the only direction worth thinking in. The weeks that followed were the first period of genuine stability the Eastern Court had known. With the Baron's recognition came a shield against external interference. No more assessors. No more threatening letters. The tax rate was fixed and fair, and Taehyeon paid it on time every season, which earned him a grudging reputation among the Baron's administrators as the only settlement leader who never argued about taxes. This was deliberate. In his old life, the companies that never argued about invoices were the ones that got priority service when they needed something. Reliability was a form of currency. The compound grew. Yoona designed and built a proper workshop with a forge extension that let her and Corgan collaborate on larger projects. Their first joint creation was a water wheel at the river bend. It was small, barely 2 meters in diameter, but it turned a grinding stone that processed grain into flour at 10 times the speed of hand milling. The first bag of flour produced by the wheel was presented to the village as a gift. The second bag was sold to the traveling merchant at twice the price of whole grain. By the end of the month, the water wheel was generating more income than the snare lines and the pelts combined. Yoona calculated that at current capacity, they could add a second wheel within 6 weeks and a sawmill attachment within 3 months. She presented these figures to Taehyeon at the weekly review with the contained excitement of someone who was accustomed to having her ideas ignored and was still adjusting to having them funded. He approved both projects on the spot. She went back to her workshop and did not come out for 14 hours. The companion count reached 20 by the end of month 2. 20 women from 20 different worlds, each with abilities and trauma and needs that Taehyeon tracked in his head and in his ledger. He had developed a system. Each new arrival spent their first 3 days in what he privately called onboarding. Day 1 was rest and food and medical assessment by Lien. Day 2 was orientation, a tour of the compound and an introduction to the other companions, and an explanation of how things worked. Day 3 was the conversation, the one-on-one where Taehyeon sat with the new arrival and asked the 3 questions, and listened, and then found their place. Not assigned, found. Like fitting a piece into a puzzle by it trying different angles until it clicked. Some clicked immediately. The 14th companion was a navigator from a world of island chains who could read wind and current and weather with supernatural precision. She became the compound's weather forecaster, and her predictions were accurate to the hour. The 16th was a cook from a world of spice empires who could identify any ingredient by smell alone. She took over the kitchen, and within a week, the food at the Eastern Court went from survival rations to something approaching actual cuisine. The 17th was an animal handler from a nomadic world, who bonded with the compound's growing collection of goats and chickens, and turned them from scattered livestock into a functioning small farm. The name Virkin first reached the Eastern Court through a merchant, a silk trader named Pol, who passed through Saerin every 3 weeks and had become a reliable source of news and goods. He arrived on day 78 with his usual cart of fabrics and spices, and an unusual expression on his face. He did not go to the market square first. He came straight to the Eastern Court and asked for Taehyeon. Pol was not a brave man. He was a small, round, careful man who measured risk in coins and avoided anything that might cost him more than he was willing to lose. The fact that he had come directly and urgently meant something had changed his personal risk calculation. Taehyeon invited him in and gave him tea. Pol drank the entire cup before speaking. He said there was a lord in the east, House Irshan, one of the 7 high houses of the Hairan crown. The lord's name was Virkan. He was 35 years old and wealthy beyond measure, and educated in 7 languages, and known throughout the kingdom for his exquisite taste in art and wine and rare things. Pol paused on the word rare.
He said Virkan collected rare systems, not items, not weapons, people, women specifically. Women with unusual or unique abilities. He bought them from slavers, or took them from conquered territories, or simply had them abducted from villages where no one would notice their absence. His estate in the eastern hills was called the Gallery. The name was not a metaphor. Inside the gallery, women were kept in rooms designed like display cases, glass walls, regulated light, labels describing their abilities engraved on brass plates mounted next to their doors. Pol stopped talking. His hands were shaking around the empty cup. He said the reason he was telling Taehyeon this was that a man from Virkan's household had been in Tehran last week, asking questions about a hollow boy in Saerin who had unusual women working for him. Women who had appeared from nowhere. Women with abilities that did not match any known system in the Crown Registry. Virkan had noticed the Eastern Court, and when Virkan noticed something rare, he came for it. Taehyeon listened to all of this without interrupting. When Pol finished, Taehyeon thanked him and gave him a bolt of Fen's best fabric at no charge. Pol took it and left quickly. He did not want to be in Saerin when Virkan's people arrived. Taehyeon sat in the yard for a long time after Pol left. Then he called a meeting, full council, all 20 companions plus Marin and Doric and Korgan. He told them everything Pol had said. He did not soften it. He did not leave out the glass rooms or the brass plates. He told them exactly what Virkan was and exactly what Virkan wanted. The room went silent. Then it went loud. Saerin stood up and said she would kill any man who tried to put her in a glass box. Duri's barrier flickered to life involuntarily. Yoona gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Lien closed her eyes and breathed slowly. Sol vanished into a shadow in the corner, which was her way of being upset. Marin was the only one who did not react visibly. She sat with her arms crossed and waited for the noise to die down. Then she looked at Taehyeon and asked how long before Virkan moved. He said he did not know, but he could estimate. In his old life, he had analyzed competitors. How fast they gathered information, how fast they made decisions, how fast they acted. Virkan had sent a scout to Tehran. The scout would report back. Virkan would evaluate. If Virkan was careful, he would send a second round of scouts. If he was confident, he would move directly. Based on distance and travel time and the bureaucratic overhead of mobilizing a noble household, Taehyeon estimated they had between 6 weeks and 3 months. Marin said she wanted the short number, 6 weeks. Plan for 6, hope for 12. She stood up and walked out. By the next morning, she had drawn up a complete defense plan, but Taehyeon was not thinking about defense. He was thinking about something else. About the glass rooms and the brass plates. About women kept like insects in a collection. About a man who saw people as objects to be cataloged and displayed. He thought about Yoona's father, who took credit for her work. About Saerin's clan that had been slaughtered. About Lien's temple that tried to burn her. About every companion who had been used and discarded and broken by someone who saw their value but not their humanity. Virkan was the same. He saw value. He saw rarity. He saw collectible assets. He did not see people. Taehyeon had managed people like that in his old life. Not cruel ones, just blind ones. Executives who looked at headcount spreadsheets and saw numbers instead of names. Who approved layoffs by percentage without knowing which percentage had children starting school that month. He had spent 12 years quietly fighting that blindness. One person at a time. One conversation at a time. One small act of remembering someone's name at a time. He could not fight Virkan with a sword, but he could fight Virkan the same way he had always fought. By building something that made the other man's way of seeing the world obsolete. He started with information. Sol was the natural choice. She could move in darkness without sound, and her eyes saw in pitch black as clearly as noon. He asked her to go east. Not to the gallery, that was too dangerous. To the towns and villages between Saerin and Virkan's territory. To listen, to watch, to learn.
Who supplied the gallery? Who worked there? Who visited? Who hated it but said nothing because Virkan was powerful and hate was expensive when you were poor? Saul looked at him when he gave her the assignment. Her eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors. She said she would go. Then she said something that surprised him. She said in her old world, she had killed for men who gave her targets. In this world, she was gathering information for a man who gave her choices. She said she preferred the second kind of work. Then she disappeared into the dark. Literally. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. Taehyeon made a mental note to install a bell on her. The next step was economic. Virkan was wealthy. The Eastern Court was not. In a direct confrontation of resources, the court would lose in the first round. But Taehyeon did not need to match Virkan's wealth. He needed to redirect it. In his old life, he had seen small companies survive against giants, not by outspending them, but by making the giants' spending inefficient. You did not attack the giant directly. You attacked the giant's supply chain, the vendors, the contractors, the people who made the giant's machinery run. If you could offer those people better terms, they would switch. Not out of loyalty, out of self-interest. Self-interest was the most reliable force in any market. He began by mapping Virkan's economic dependencies. The information came in slowly, over weeks, through Seoul's reports and through conversations with merchants and travelers who passed through Saerin. Virkan's gallery required constant supplies. Food for the captives, materials for the display rooms, guards needed payment, servants needed wages. The entire operation ran on a network of local suppliers who delivered goods to the gallery because Virkan paid above market rate. Above market rate. That was the key. It meant the suppliers were loyal to the price, not to the man. If someone offered them a better deal, or a deal of equal value with less risk of being associated with a notorious collector, they might switch. It would take months. It would require careful approach. But it was possible. Taehyeon started sending trade missions east. Not military, commercial. Finn's fabrics, Yoona's tools, Hana's superior grain. He sent them with friendly merchants who owed him favors. Not to Virkan directly, but to the villages around the gallery. Good products at fair prices from a settlement that did not enslave anyone. The message was implicit. You have options. You do not have to buy from the man who keeps women in glass boxes. Some villages took the trade. Some did not. But everyone that did was a thread pulled from Virkan's web. Parallel to the economic campaign, Taehyeon continued building. The Eastern Court now had 65 residents, 24 companions, a functioning economy, a trained defense force, a reputation that extended beyond Saerin to Tehran and 3 other nearby villages. Yoona's second water wheel was operational. The sawmill attachment was ahead of schedule. Korgan had taken on 2 apprentices. Doric had built a proper carpentry workshop. Lien's healing station now served patients from 5 villages in the region. People traveled half a day to reach her because she was the only healer within 3 days' ride who did not charge based on system status. Hana's fields were producing yields that the old farmers said were impossible. Gol, the skeptical farmer, had become her loudest advocate, telling anyone who would listen that the soil witch from the Eastern Court had saved his harvest. The bathhouse had been expanded twice. Soap was now produced in quantity. Real soap, from rendered fat and wood ash, processed by a technique that Taehyeon refined over 4 batches. The first batch was too soft, the second was too harsh, the third was adequate, the fourth was good. He gave the soap a name because products with names sold better than products without. He called it East Block. Yoona laughed when she heard the name. She did not know why it was funny. He told her it was an inside joke from his old life. She said his old life sounded very strange. He said she had no idea. Seoul returned on day 91. She came back at night because she always came back at night. Taehyeon was awake because he had learned to keep her hours when she was due. He sat at the fire with a pot of tea and a bowl of stew he had kept warm under a clay cover. She materialized out of the darkness, like smoke forming into a person. She sat across from him and ate the stew without a word. When she was done, she began talking. The gallery was worse than Paul had described.
43 women held in individual chambers. Each chamber was climate-controlled, using a combination of runic heating and ventilation shafts designed by engineers who had been well paid to build a beautiful prison. The glass walls were not glass. They were crystallized mana, transparent, unbreakable by anything short of a siege weapon. The brass plates were real. Each one listed the captive's name and world of origin and ability and estimated value in gold crowns. The highest valued woman was a weather manipulator from a world of floating islands. She was worth 300,000 crowns. The lowest valued was a girl who could change the color of her skin. She was worth 800. Both were equally imprisoned. Virkan visited the gallery every evening. He walked the corridor slowly. He stopped at each chamber and looked in. Sometimes he spoke to the women. Sometimes he did not. He wore white gloves the entire time. Sol said the gallery had 36 guards, 12 on day shift, 12 on night, 12 rotating. They were well trained, not soldiers, something closer to jailers crossed with bodyguards. They carried short swords and light crossbows and wore uniforms of black and silver. The estate itself was large, a main house with 50 rooms, servant quarters for 80 staff, stables for 40 horses, 3 walled gardens, an armory that would make Marin weep with envy. Virkan also maintained a field force of 120 soldiers, garrisoned in a town called Reshk, 2 hours east of the estate. These were proper soldiers, heavy infantry, equipped with systems. The cheapest system among them was a basic iron skin enhancement. The most expensive was a lieutenant who could project force walls similar to Duri's barriers, but larger and stronger. Taehyeon absorbed the information like water into dry earth. He asked Sol about the staff, the servants, the cooks, the stable hands, the people who cleaned and maintained and kept the machinery of the estate running. Sol said they were local villagers employed at good wages. Many had worked there for years. They knew about the gallery. Everyone knew. But they said nothing, because the wages were better than anything else in the region, and because speaking against a high house lord was a reliable way to disappear. However, Sol paused. She said there was one exception, the head butler, a man named Gren. He had served Virkan's household for 20 years. He ran the estate with meticulous precision. He managed the staff. He managed the supplies. He managed the schedules. He was the man who made sure the gallery's temperatures were correct, and the food was on time, and the uniforms were pressed. And according to 3 separate servants Sol had spoken to in taverns, Gren hated Virkan, with a hatred so deep and so quiet it had become invisible. He hated him because 6 years ago Virkan had acquired a new collection piece. A young woman with the ability to sing music that healed emotional wounds. She had been Gren's daughter. Taehyeon sat with this information for a long time. Then he asked Sol if Gren could be reached. Sol said she had not approached him. Too risky during a first reconnaissance, but she had mapped his routines. He drank at a tavern in the village below the estate every 7th day, always alone, always in the corner, always exactly 2 cups of wine, never more. Taehyeon said she had done extraordinary work. She looked at him in the firelight. Her reflective eyes blinked once. Then she picked up the clay cover that had been over the stew bowl and placed it upside down on her head like a hat. Taehyeon stared at her. She stared back with the clay cover on her head, and her face completely serious. Then the corner of her mouth trembled. It was the first time he had ever seen Sol express anything resembling humor. He started laughing. She did not laugh, but the mouth tremor continued for several seconds, which was her version of it. The council meeting the next morning was the most serious they had held. Taehyeon laid out Sol's intelligence on the dirt floor using stones and sticks. The estate here. The garrison here. The gallery here. The guard rotations here. The staff quarters here. Gren's tavern here. Marin studied the layout for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she said, taking the gallery by force was suicide. 120 professional soldiers with systems against their current force of 24 companions and maybe 30 local volunteers. Even with the wall and the watchtowers, defending was one thing. Attacking into that kind of strength was another. Saerin disagreed. She said she could take 12 of the guards herself. Marin said that was probably true. She also said the remaining 24 guards, plus 120 garrison soldiers, would then kill everyone else while Saerin was busy with her 12. Saerin shut her mouth again. 2 for 2 on Marin shutting her down with facts. Taehyeon said he did not intend to attack the gallery. He intended to empty it. The room went quiet. He explained. Virkin's power rested on 3 pillars: his wealth, his soldiers, his reputation. All 3 could be undermined without a single sword being drawn. The wealth came from trade and taxation of his territory. The trade missions Taehyeon had already launched were the first cuts. Small, barely noticeable, but compounding over time. Each village that switched to Eastern Court goods was revenue Virkin did not collect.
The soldiers were loyal because they were paid. If the pay became irregular, the loyalty would thin. It always did. The reputation was the most fragile pillar. Virkin's status among the high houses depended on his image as a sophisticated collector and patron of rare talent. If that image shifted to reveal what he actually was, a man who kept women in glass cages, the other houses might not care morally, but they would care politically because association with scandal was a liability. Taehyeon did not need to defeat Virkin. He needed to make Virkin expensive to support. But the centerpiece of the plan was Gren, the butler who hated his master, the father whose daughter sang in a glass cage. Taehyeon said he would go to the tavern himself. Marin said absolutely not. Saerin said absolutely not. Yoona said that was reckless. Leon said she was worried. Duri offered to go instead. Sol said she could deliver a message. Taehyeon heard all of them. Then he said he was going.
Because some conversations could not be had through messengers. Some conversations required a person sitting across the table from another person and looking them in the eye and saying, "I know what he did to your daughter, and I am going to get her out." Marin stared at him for a very long time. Then she said she would send Saerin and Sol as hidden escort, 2 shadows he would not see, but who would be there if the meeting went wrong. He accepted the compromise. The journey east took 4 days. Taehyeon traveled light, a pack with food and water and trade goods to justify his presence as a merchant. Saerin followed at a distance, close enough to reach him in 30 seconds. Sol followed at a distance, close enough to reach him instantly, though he suspected she was actually closer than that, because twice during the journey he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up for no visible reason. The Eastern Territory was different from Saerin. Richer soil, bigger towns, better roads. Also more guards on those roads, wearing the black and silver of House Urshan. Taehyeon passed through 2 checkpoints by presenting himself as a fabric merchant from the west. The guards barely looked at him. A skinny boy with a pack of cloth was not interesting to men who watched for smugglers and spies. The tavern was called the Iron Cup, a solid stone building in the village of Reshk. It served workers from the estate and soldiers from the garrison. Taehyeon arrived on the 7th day of the week, the day Gren drank. He chose a table near the corner. He ordered wine he could not afford and drank it slowly. The tavern was half full. Soldiers at the bar, workers at the tables. The usual noise of men who had finished their day and were converting coins into temporary happiness. Gren arrived at his usual time. Taehyeon had seen the description Sol provided. Tall, thin, gray hair. Precisely dressed, even off-duty. Hands that moved with the careful economy of someone who spent his life managing the movements of others. Gren took his corner table, ordered 2 cups of wine, sat alone. Taehyeon waited until the first cup was finished. Then he stood and walked to Gren's table and sat down across from him without asking permission. Gren looked at him with the polite, blank expression of a man who dealt with interruptions professionally. Taehyeon said 1 sentence. He said he knew about the girl who sang. Gren's expression did not change, but his hand stopped moving toward the second cup of wine. It hovered in the air for a fraction of a second. Then it continued to the cup and lifted it. He drank, set the cup down, looked at Taehyeon. He asked who he was. Taehyeon said he was the hollow boy from Saerin, the one Virkin's scouts had been asking about. Grin's eyes narrowed. He asked what the hollow boy wanted with a butler. Taehyeon said he wanted to give Grin his daughter back. Grin did not move. His face did not change, but something happened behind his eyes. A door opening. Or maybe a door that had been locked for 6 years, trembling on its hinges. He asked how. Taehyeon said he did not know yet, but he said he had 24 women who had all been somewhere like the gallery. Each one of them had been trapped by someone who saw them as an object. Each one of them was free now. He said Grin's daughter would be the 25th, or the 50th, or the 100th, however long it took. He said he did not need Grin to betray his master tonight. He did not need secrets or keys or maps. He needed Grin to do one thing. Keep being the perfect butler. Keep running the estate flawlessly. Keep Virkin comfortable and confident and certain that everything was under his control. Because a man who felt in control did not look for the walls shifting around him. And by the time he noticed, the walls had already moved. Grin stared at him for a very long time.
The second cup of wine sat untouched. Then he spoke in a voice that was steady and quiet and full of something that had been compressed into a very small space for a very long time. He said his daughter's name was Haeun. He said she had been 17 when Virkan took her. She was 23 now. He said she still sang. He could hear her sometimes through the walls when he walked the corridor at night. He said the song was different now, slower, sadder, like a bird that had forgotten what the sky looked like but still remembered that it existed. He said if the hollow boy could bring her home, he would keep the estate running so smoothly that Virkan would not notice the ground dissolving beneath his feet until he was already falling. He did not shake Taehyeon's hand. He stood up and walked out of the tavern at exactly his usual time by exactly his usual route. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But everything had. Taehyeon sat at the table and finished his wine. It was cheap and sour and tasted like the beginning of something. He paid and left. Somewhere in the shadows outside, Saerin and Sol were watching. He did not look for them. He walked back to the road and began the 4-day journey home. In his chest, the altar hummed, steadily counting seconds toward the next sunset. Behind him, in a stone estate on a hill, a butler walked the corridor of a gallery of glass cages, and for the first time in 6 years, did not look at the ground when he passed his daughter's door. He looked straight at her. She was singing. He stopped and listened. She saw him through the glass. She did not stop singing. But she tilted her head slightly, a question without words. He placed one hand flat against the crystal wall, just for a second. Then he straightened his jacket and walked on. Perfect, precise, invisible, exactly as instructed. The months that followed were quiet in the way a bowstring is quiet before release.
Taehyeon returned from the east and immediately restructured the Eastern Court's priorities. Defense was no longer the first concern. Information was. He created what he privately called the Intelligence Department, though out loud he called it the Trade Network, because intelligence departments attracted attention, and trade networks did not. Sol ran the field operations. She trained 3 of the newer companions in basic observation techniques, how to listen in a tavern without appearing to listen, how to remember faces and routes and numbers, how to move through a town without being remembered. She was a patient teacher, which surprised everyone, including herself. Taehyeon assigned Chijia to the analysis side. She had arrived on day 36, the 8th companion, a quiet woman with a long black braid who knew 1,000 runic formulas and could read 7 dead languages. Her ability was not combat, it was comprehension.
She could look at a page of text in any language and understand its meaning within minutes. She could cross-reference documents at a speed that made Taehyeon think of database software. He gave her every scrap of written information that Sol and the merchants brought back. Trade records, tax notices, land deeds, letters that had been copied or stolen or found in the trash behind government offices. Chia organized them into patterns.
She built a map of House Urshan's finances that covered an entire wall of the library she now managed. The library was a room in the expanded compound that Taehyeon had officially registered in her name, her personal property. The deed was signed by the Baron's own registrar. When she received the document, she held it for a very long time without speaking. Then she placed it in a wooden frame she built herself and hung it on the library wall. It was the first thing she had ever owned.
The Eastern Court's population crossed 100 on day 110. The growth was no longer just from companions and refugees. Families were choosing to relocate. Farmers who had heard about Hana's crop yields, craftsmen who had heard about Yoona's workshop, workers who had heard about fair wages and clean water, and a healer who did not charge based on your system status. Taehyeon processed each new arrival through the same system: name, skills, needs, placement. The ledger was now 3 volumes thick. He knew every name. He tested himself on this every night before sleep, going through the list in order of arrival: name, face, need, status. It was his version of counting sheep, except it kept him awake more often than it put him to sleep, because inevitably he would remember that someone needed new boots, or that someone's child had been coughing last week, and he would make a note to check in the morning. Yoona's engineering corps had grown to 8 people, 5 locals trained by her and 3 companions with technical abilities from their own worlds. They had completed the second water wheel, the sawmill, a mechanical grain elevator that lifted harvest from the fields to the storage building using a system of pulleys and counterweights that Yoona had designed on the back of a flour sack during lunch. Corgan's smithy now had 2 full-time apprentices and produced enough iron tools and hardware to supply the compound and trade the surplus. The economy of the Eastern Court was no longer dependent on rabbit pelts and goodwill. It ran on flour and lumber and tools and soap and Fen's fabrics, which had become unexpectedly popular in 3 neighboring villages because the quality was better than anything the local weavers produced. Fen herself was astonished by this. In her world, she had been considered average. Here, her average was exceptional because the baseline was so much lower. Taeyeon told her that context was everything. She said she preferred this context. The military side was Marin's domain, and she ran it with the quiet intensity of a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for something and was determined to be ready when it arrived. The defense force now numbered 40, 24 companions with combat-relevant abilities, and 16 local volunteers who trained 3 evenings a week. Marin had organized them into 4 squads of 10. Each squad had a companion squad leader and a mix of abilities designed to cover each other's weaknesses. Saerin led the assault squad, fast, aggressive, first to engage. Duri led the shield squad, defensive, anchoring. Their job was to hold ground and protect the non-combatants. Sol led the shadow squad, reconnaissance, flanking, disruption. They operated at night, and their primary weapon was confusion. The 4th squad was led by a companion named Vex, who had arrived on day 52 from a world of aerial combat. She could not fly, but she could jump higher and farther than any human, and she could throw objects with terrifying accuracy. Her squad specialized in ranged harassment, stones, javelins, improvised projectiles, anything that could hit an enemy before the enemy reached the wall. Taeyeon watched the training from the wall one evening as all 4 squads ran a coordinated defense drill. Marin stood on the command platform calling signals. The squads moved in response. Not perfectly, not yet, but with a cohesion that had not existed 3 months ago. These were not soldiers. They were women from 20 different worlds who had been broken and rebuilt, and who now moved together because they had chosen to protect the same thing. Marin called a halt. She turned to Taeyeon and said they were ready for 50, not for 120. He said 50 would have to be enough for now. She said it would not be enough when Virkin came. He said Virkin was not going to send soldiers first. She asked what he was going to send. Taeyeon said he was going to send a letter. The letter arrived 3 days later. It came by courier. A man in black and silver livery on a fine horse. He presented the letter at the gate with the formality of someone delivering a royal decree. The letter was written on cream paper in elegant script. It was addressed to the proprietor of the eastern settlement of Saerin, not to Taeyeon by name,
to the proprietor. It was from Lord Virken of House Irshan. It said Lord Virken had heard of the remarkable community being built in the eastern reaches of Barony Kelst. It said Lord Virken was a patron of rare talents and an admirer of unusual achievements. It said Lord Virken would be honored to extend an invitation for the proprietor to visit the Irshan estate at the proprietor's convenience to discuss matters of mutual interest and potential partnership. The letter was polite, warm even. It smelled faintly of expensive perfume.
Taehyeon read it and felt cold. He showed the letter to the council. The reactions were predictable. Saerin wanted to send the courier back with the letter stuffed in his mouth. Duri wanted to strengthen the wall. Yoona wanted to build something that would make the wall unnecessary. Lien said nothing, but her hands were clenched in her lap. Sol had already left to increase surveillance on the eastern roads. Marin read the letter and set it down carefully. She said the invitation was genuine, not because Virken was friendly, but because Virken was confident. A confident predator did not attack first. It circled. It displayed. It gave the prey a chance to surrender willingly, because willing prey was cheaper than caught prey. Taehyeon agreed. He said he would not accept the invitation. He would also not refuse it. He would delay. Politely, with the bureaucratic grace of a man who had spent 12 years navigating corporate politics. He drafted a response. 3 pages of elaborate gratitude and scheduling difficulties and requests for agenda clarification and expressions of deep respect that said absolutely nothing while taking up an enormous amount of expensive paper. Yoona read the draft and said she did not understand a single word of it. He said that was the point. The response bought 2 weeks. Then, Virkan sent a second letter. Shorter, less perfumed. It said the Lord's schedule was flexible and suggested 3 specific dates. Taehyeon responded with regret that none of the dates were suitable due to seasonal obligations. But perhaps the Lord would consider alternative arrangements, such as sending a representative for preliminary discussions. This bought another 10 days. The third letter dropped the pretense of warmth. It said Lord Virkan expected a response, confirming a visit within 14 days. Failure to respond would be interpreted as discourtesy. In the language of the high houses, discourtesy was 1 step below hostility. Taehyeon read this letter and knew the circling phase was ending. He sent Aishli, the 5th companion, the one from the world of gunslingers and bounty hunters. She was 17 now, red-haired, freckled. Armed with 2 pistols that fired alchemical rounds, she and Yoona had reverse-engineered from her original ammunition. She had a mouth that could make a sailor blush, and a smile that could make the same sailor blush for entirely different reasons. She was the last person anyone would send as a diplomat, which was exactly why Taehyeon sent her. He briefed her for 3 days. What to say, what not to say, what to observe, what to remember. Most importantly, what to feel. He told her that Virken would try to make her feel small, try to make her feel like an object being evaluated. He told her to let him try, and to remember every detail of how he tried. Because those details would tell them more about his weaknesses than 100 scouting reports. Aishli rode east with Saul as invisible escort and 2 local men as visible escort. She arrived at the Irshan estate on a Tuesday and was received in the main hall by Grin himself. Grin showed no recognition. He led her through the estate with the practiced courtesy of a man who had welcomed thousands of guests. The main house was magnificent. Marble floors, painted ceilings, tapestries that probably cost more than Soren's entire annual output. Virken met her in a sitting room overlooking the gardens. He was exactly as described. Tall, handsome, impeccably dressed. White gloves, 7 languages worth of smooth conversation. He poured her wine personally. He asked about the Eastern Court with the warm curiosity of a collector examining a new exhibit. He asked about the women, their abilities, their origins, how they had been acquired. He used the word acquired. Aishli answered in character, blunt, unpolished, country girl visiting the big estate for the first time. She told him the Eastern Court was a farming community with some unusual residents. She said the proprietor was a hollow boy who was good at catching rabbits and bad at everything else. She said the women had arrived through means she did not fully understand, and mostly spent their time arguing about whose turn it was to clean the bathhouse. Virken smiled throughout.
It was the smile of a man who was not fooled for a second, but enjoyed watching the performance. When the visit ended after 3 hours, he escorted Aishle to the gate personally. He held her hand for a moment too long and said he hoped to meet the proprietor himself soon. Aishle smiled back and said the proprietor hoped so too. Then she mounted her horse and rode west. She reported back to Taehyeon that evening. She had observed everything. The guard rotations matched Seoul's intelligence. The staff moved with the precision of Gren's management.
The gallery was not visible from any guest area, which meant it was deliberately hidden from casual visitors. Virkin had asked 47 questions during their conversation. Winter arrived early. The first frost came on day 140, and by day 150, the ground was frozen hard enough to ring like iron under a boot heel. Taehyeon had prepared 3 months of grain in the expanded granary, smoked meat in rows in the smokehouse, firewood stacked in walls around every building. Yoona had installed a heating system using clay pipes that carried hot air from central fire pits through the floors. It leaked smoke at 2 joints that she spent a furious afternoon resealing, but it kept the buildings warm enough that no one slept cold. This was the real test. Not combat, not politics. Winter. In a medieval economy, winter was the real enemy. It killed more people than any army. The villages around Saerin expected to lose between 5 and 15% of their population every cold season. Taehyeon did not accept inevitable. He organized the winter effort like a logistics operation. Food distribution was centralized. Lien and 2 assistants conducted health checks on every resident every 7 days. Children under 10 and adults over 60 were given extra rations without having to ask. The bathhouse stayed running. Yoona's heating pipes were extended to the healing station first. Hana had planted winter vegetables in sheltered beds along the south wall. Turnips, onions, hardy greens. They would not feed 100 people, but they added nutrition that stored grain could not provide. When the first real cold snap hit and 3 homes lost their fires overnight, Taehyeon sent firewood before anyone asked. He sent Lien to an old woman who collapsed from hypothermia. He sent heated broth to a sick child's family. This was not charity. It was infrastructure. The village was part of his supply chain. Every healthy villager was a resource. Every dead villager was a loss. Cold logic, delivered with warm hands, looked like kindness. And kindness was the currency that bought loyalty no coin could purchase. By day 170, the Eastern Court had become the center of gravity for the entire region. When people needed something done, they came to the Eastern Court. Disputes went to Taehyeon, because his ledger tracked every agreement. Medical emergencies went to Lien. Building problems went to Yoona. The compound was not a government. It was a service. And services that people depended on became governments, whether they meant to or not. The companion count reached 40 by midwinter. Saerin, who had been cold and monosyllabic in her first weeks, now sat with frightened new companions and told them in her blunt way that this place was real, and the boy with the cloak was real, and no one was going to put them in a cage. She said this with the authority of someone who had believed none of it herself when she arrived, and now believed all of it. The snow brought a visitor from the south. A woman on horseback, wrapped in furs, riding through the snowstorm as if it were a mild drizzle. She introduced herself as Yara, a representative of House Keln, one of the 7 high houses, not Urshan. She said House Keln had been observing the Eastern Court with interest. She said Virkin's interest had also been noted. She said House Keln and House Urshan had a complicated history. Complicated meant hostile. She said House Keln might be interested in ensuring the Eastern Court remained independent of Urshan influence, for a price. The price was formal diplomatic recognition under House Keln's protection. In exchange, the court would grant preferential trade terms and first refusal on any military alliance. Taehyeon considered it. House Keln's protection would make Virkin's aggression politically costly, but it would also make the court a piece on someone else's board. He had played enough Crusader kings to know what happened to small states that accepted protection from large ones. The council meeting that night lasted 3 hours. Marin said accept. Saerin said reject. Yoona said the trade terms were fine, but the military clause was too open. Jizia had analyzed House Keln's treaties and found a pattern. 5 years of support, then increasing demands, then absorption. Sol slid a piece of paper under the table. One word. Delay. Taehyeon took Sol's advice. He sent Yara a modified framework. Not full recognition. A limited trade agreement with a mutual defense clause that activated only against unprovoked aggression by a third party. Specific enough to cover Virkan. Vague enough to avoid binding the court to Keln's broader conflicts. A 2-year sunset provision. Yara accepted. The agreement was signed on bark paper. It was the first treaty the Eastern Court had ever made. Taehyeon looked at his signature and felt the weight of it. Every name in his ledger was now covered by this piece of bark. He had promised them a place to exist. Now he had to make sure the game did not eat the place alive.